There's been major discussion, especially lately since Trump and Zelensky just met, as to whether or not the United States should continue to fund Ukraine. And there are real arguments, including moral arguments, both for and against continuing to fund Ukraine. That will not be the purpose of today's video. Today, we're going to focus primarily on the financial and geopolitical lens. Why? Well, because in science, if we want to come to actual conclusions that can be used, we have to try to isolate variables as best as possible. So that is what we're going to focus on. So as always, my name is Derek, and I got my degree in finance, so you don't have to. Let's get started. So let's start with the financial lens. The main argument that I've heard against continuing to fund Ukraine, at least from a financial perspective, is simply why. People ask, why should we send hundreds of billions of dollars overseas to fight an enemy that we don't see when that money could instead be used in country, in other areas? And in order to answer that question, we first have to understand how much money we're even sending to Ukraine. Now, Donald Trump has gone on record saying that it's over $350 billion. That's simply not the case. The real number is closer to $120 billion by most sources' estimates. Now, the next thing that we have to do is we have to put that word, sent, under a microscope. What does sending money, $120 billion in this case, to Ukraine actually mean? Well, most people might think that this means us sending cash to Ukraine, but that is not the case. It is estimated that anywhere from 80 to 90% of Ukraine funding never leaves the United States. How? How does that happen? Well, because we are not funding Ukraine with money, we are funding Ukraine with defensive aid. And most of that defensive aid is made by American companies. So this $120 billion or so in funding, in actuality, really doesn't leave the United States, which means a couple of things. It means, one, that we are funding American companies. And yes, I know that there are arguments against the military-industrial complex. I myself have made those arguments, and I think that there are major flaws when it comes to that industry. Regardless, funneling money through that industry does increase GDP, and it does support American jobs. So this is not money that's just being sent willy-nilly overseas. And another thing that I think most people don't consider is the decommissioning of munitions. The United States decommissions munitions after a certain period in time because as these munitions age, they fall below our standard. Now, usually this costs us money to do. What are we doing now? Instead, we're sending these older munitions overseas to be used in this conflict, and we are then replenishing our own stockpiles with newer, more technologically advanced defensive equipment. So, all in all, when we hear that we're sending hundreds of billions of dollars overseas, yes, that sounds like a ton of money, and it sounds like we should instead be using that at home. But the actuality is that most of that money never leaves the United States, and that most of that money is funneled into American companies, which, whether we agree or not with the military-industrial complex, is supporting U.S. jobs and U.S. GDP. In fact, directly because of this conflict, companies like General Dynamics have reported a 25% increase in year-over-year revenue. And Raytheon has reported over $3 billion in new contracts to replenish the old munition stockpiles that we are sending overseas. So yes, hundreds of billions of dollars is a massive number, but in reality, it's closer to $100 billion than it is to $200 billion. And most of that money, like $90 billion plus of that money, remains inside the United States. And not only that, but demand for these US-based defensive companies have increased internationally as well. US-based defense companies have signed over $80 billion in new international deals from our allies. This is done through the Foreign Military Sales Program, which has reported a 55% increase. Again, I have to remind you, we are looking at this through a purely financial and geopolitical lens. We have to separate morals, at least for this video. Trust me, I do not condone war. I think it is one of the worst things that humankind takes part in. But for the purpose of this video, we are focusing on the financial and geopolitical lens. And when we focus on that lens, it doesn't end at defense contractors. American energy companies are also benefiting massively, and that's because since the beginning of this war, many European countries have cut off the import of natural gas from Russia. And of course, who's replacing that supply? US LNG producers. In fact, in 2023, 48% of Europe's natural gas supply came from American suppliers. This is up from 27% in 2022. So the key takeaway when it comes to the financial lens is 1. The funding of Ukraine does not just benefit Ukraine. It benefits massively the United States by increasing GDP and by supporting US companies and US jobs, not just in the defensive sector, but also in the natural gas and energy sector. And again, setting morals aside just for this video, when we look at it purely from that lens, it starts to seem more like a financial benefit than it does a financial negative for the United States. Okay, and now we have to look at it from the other lens, a geopolitical lens. And in order to do that, we have to understand some things. 1, there are really 2 major powers on Earth that oppose Western values. Those are China and Russia. While there have been intermittent periods of cooperation between the United States and Russia, for the most part, Russia is our adversary. And when we look at this conflict from that lens, it also seems to be a massive win for the United States geopolitically. And that's because the United States is wearing down a major global adversary for pennies on the dollar with 0 US boots on the ground. This, for all intents and purposes, is a proxy war between the United States and Russia. And what's interesting about this proxy war is that Russia directly started it by invading Ukraine. So, while the United States has a history of meddling in other countries' affairs and starting wars, in this instance, it was not the United States that was the aggressor. It was Russia. And because of this set up the United States in a particularly good position geopolitically to counter Russian aggression. And not only has this conflict worn away at Russia militarily, economically, and manpower-wise, but it has also united basically the entirety of Europe. And that is because Europe remembers what appeasing an aggressor looks like, because that is what happened in World War II. And Europe, being very much at ground zero during World War II, remembers best. And geopolitically, this conflict has strengthened the resolve, not just of Europe, but of NATO. Since the start of this conflict, both Finland and Sweden have both joined NATO. This is the first time since 2020 that new members have been added. And if we're going to align with Western values, that is a good thing. And once again, looking at this through a geopolitical lens, this conflict has finally done what the United States has been asking Europe to do for many years now: increase defensive spending. NATO has a 2% of GDP target for member nations when it comes to defensive spending. And historically, a lot of countries don't meet that target. But as of now, 23 of the 32 members meet or exceed the 2% target. And this is surely going to grow in the years to come. And what does that mean for the United States? Well, 1, it means less reliance on the US for defense, which is good for Europe. But it's also good for the United States, so long as we actually spend that money in other areas that can help US citizens. Whether that happens or not is a debate for a completely different video. The point of this video is that when we measure this conflict purely in a strategic payoff lens, focusing on both financial and geopolitical aspects, this has been a major win for the United States. Again, this is barring any moral arguments or any other arguments which I do understand are real valid points. But the purpose of this video was to focus on those 2 things. And when it comes to those 2 things, the United States has massively won. So has Europe, because it has shown that Russia is not the superpower that it once was. It also has shown that Russia and Russia's military are not as strong as they once were perceived to be. And when we extrapolate this further, What does it mean? Well, it means that the United States, as well as other Western-aligned countries, that means democracies, can shift more focus to China. China is the other major world adversary to the United States. China and Russia represent the two major powers that have opposing views to Western democracies and Western values. And we can argue all day whether those values are better or worse. Again, not the purpose of this video. The purpose of this video is to say that from a strategic standpoint, as cold and calculated as one can be, this is a massive win for the United States because it allows focus to be shifted to China, and it also strengthens the resolve of NATO and Western-aligned countries. Now, what I didn't cover in this video is, of course, Trump, because Trump is seemingly wanting to take the United States down a different direction. Whether that actually happens or not, I don't know. Whether these are just negotiation tactics or not, I don't know. All I know is that the argument that this conflict in Ukraine is a financial strain on the United States, or that we shouldn't be spending hundreds of billions of dollars overseas, while valid to a degree, is, in my opinion, probably misunderstood by most people who are saying it. And again, I want to stress, this video is purposely leaving out the moral argument because that is a completely different topic. And for those of you that see moral wrongs in continuing to fund a war, I understand that. Trust me, I do. But to try to stick to the scientific method and to try and eliminate as many variables as possible, we have not focused on those arguments in this video. War sucks, and anyone who says otherwise is lost. I understand that. But we live in the real world, and until we get to a world where war doesn't exist, this is the unfortunate reality. And because of that, countries like the United States and Europe have to try to make the best strategic decisions possible. I hope this video was informative. If it was, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel out tremendously. And if you like personal finance, world economics, and investing, then you are in the right place because those are usually the topic of discussion on this channel. Once in a while, we will do something like this as long as I can relate it to finance, investing, or world economics. And with that said, I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day, and I hope to see you in the next video. Until then, take care.